December 20, 1944. The morning air in Butgenbach, Belgium, carries the metallic scent of frost and cordite. Snow clings to the evergreens that line the narrow road winding through this village of stone farmhouses and winter silence. The ground trembles, not from nature, but from something manufactured, something deliberate. A low rumble that grows with each passing second, the unmistakable growl of Maybach engines pushing 30 tons of German steel up the road. Through the morning mist, dark shapes emerge like prehistoric beasts materializing from another age. Panzer IV, 3 of them. Their long-barreled 75 guns sweep left and right, searching. Behind them, the grey-clad figures of German infantry move in practiced formation, weapons at the ready, boots crunching through the December snow. The sound is hypnotic, terrible, mechanical. It is the sound that has conquered nations. In a hastily dug gun pit beside the road, Corporal Henry Fred Warner feels the vibration through the frozen earth before he sees them. 21 years old, born in Troy, North Carolina, to a world of tobacco farms and church socials, Warner had been selling shoes in a department store just 2 years ago, measuring feet and smiling at customers. Now he crouches behind a 57 anti-tank gun, hands blackened with oil and dirt, breath visible in the cold air. Around him, the soil is packed tight from weeks of digging, reinforcing, preparing. Spent shell casings lie scattered in the bottom of the pit from the fighting 3 days prior. The gun itself is a British design, the Ordnance QF 6-pounder, manufactured under license in America. It weighs over a ton, sits low to the ground on its split trail carriage, and when fired, it produces a crack so violent it feels like the air itself is being torn apart. Warner's crew consists of 3 men besides himself. Young men, replacement soldiers, most of them, green as summer grass. 9 out of every 10 men in the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment are replacements now. The Huichen Forest devoured the veterans. Those dark woods to the east consumed entire companies, leaving behind men like Warner, survivors who now lead boys into combat. But Warner does not think of this. He thinks of the tanks. He counts them. 3. He calculates angles, measures distance with his eyes, checks the breech of the gun one more time. His .45 caliber pistol sits in its holster on his hip. Standard issue. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. He has never fired it at anything but paper targets. He does not expect to need it today. This is tank country. This is artillery and high-velocity steel. The pistol is ceremonial, something to make him feel like a soldier when he is not behind the gun. The mythology of the Panzer preceded its arrival in Belgium by 4 years. In September 1939, Poland fell in 27 days. Newsreels showed columns of German tanks rolling across plains, dust rising in their wake, soldiers fleeing before them. In May 1940, France collapsed in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, a nation with thousands of tanks, millions of soldiers, fortifications that stretched for miles, all shattered by mobile warfare and coordinated attacks. The word blitzkrieg entered the vocabulary of the world. Lightning war. It suggested speed, power, inevitability. German propaganda embraced it, even though the term never appeared in official Wehrmacht doctrine. German generals had not invented some revolutionary new form of combat. They had simply combined existing elements: tanks, aircraft, motorized infantry, radio communication, and aggressive command initiative. But the results spoke for themselves. Belgium 4 days, Netherlands 5 days, Yugoslavia 11 days, Greece 24 days. By the summer of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched into the Soviet Union, the Panzer divisions seemed genuinely unstoppable, mythological in their power. They drove hundreds of miles into Russian territory, encircling entire armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The black cross on grey armor became a symbol of modern military dominance, the armored fist of industrial warfare. But mythology is selective. It remembers victories and forgets setbacks. It highlights strengths and obscures weaknesses. The panzer divisions that rolled through France in 1940 nearly ran out of fuel multiple times. Their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Maintenance issues plagued the force. German tanks broke down with frustrating regularity. their complex transmissions and engines requiring constant repair. At the Battle of Stan in May 1940, a single French 25 mm anti-tank gun, positioned in ambush, destroyed multiple German tanks in minutes. French Char B-1 bis heavy tanks, when properly employed, devastated German formations. Captain Pierre Billart, commanding a Char B-1 named Jura, destroyed 13 German panzers in a single morning near Stan, his thick armor impervious to their fire. His own tank absorbed 140 hits and survived. The difference was not technological superiority. It was doctrine, training, communication, and the willingness to accept risk. The Germans concentrated their armor. The French dispersed theirs. The Germans delegated authority to field commanders. The French centralized control. The Germans moved quickly and exploited success. The French waited for orders and reinforced failure. And so the mythology grew, built not on invincibility but on operational excellence and enemy mistakes. By December 1944, much had changed. The panzer divisions were shadows of their former strength. Losses on the Eastern Front had been catastrophic. Entire armored formations ceased to exist, consumed by Stalingrad, Kursk, the retreat across the Ukraine. Replacement vehicles came slower than losses accrued. Fuel shortages limited training, limited operations, limited everything. New crews received abbreviated instruction, sometimes only weeks before being committed to combat. The qualitative edge had dulled, and yet the mythology persisted. When German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Allied intelligence initially struggled to comprehend what was happening. Surely the Germans could not mount a major offensive. Surely their strength was spent. But Hitler had scraped together reserves, assembled new formations, hoarded fuel and ammunition for one last gamble. 28 divisions, 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks and assault guns. They crashed into the Ardennes forest on December 16, targeting a weakly held sector of the American line, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The plan was ambitious, perhaps delusional, but its initial results were devastating. American units shattered under the assault. Prisoners were taken by the thousands. In some sectors, panic rippled through inexperienced troops. The word spread through the rear areas. The panzers were coming. The unstoppable panzers. Henry Warner and the men of the 2nd Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment were pulled from their positions east of Aachen and rushed south to Belgium. They traveled through the night in open trucks, cold gnawing at their hands and faces, exhaustion pulling at their eyelids. No one knew exactly what was happening, only that it was bad, very bad, and they were needed immediately. The 26th Infantry was part of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one of the Army's most experienced formations. But experience was relative now. The battalion had been gutted in the Huichen forest fighting. Of the officers present when Warner arrived, only 7 had been with the unit a month earlier. The rest were new. The enlisted men were even greener. They reached the village of Butgenbach on December 17 and immediately began digging. The ground was frozen. The work was brutal, but the alternative was worse. Intelligence indicated that the 12th SS Panzer Division was in the area. Elite troops, fanatical troops, young men raised in Hitler youth camps, indoctrinated since childhood, believers in the Führer and the fatherland, willing to die for both. They came with Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, Panzer Roman IV half-tracks, assault guns, and an overwhelming desire to break through to the Meuse River and beyond. Warner's gun position was along the main road, one of several anti-tank guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The tactic was simple: let the tanks come close, then hit them from multiple angles. The 57 mm gun could penetrate the side and rear armor of a Panzer Roman IV at reasonable range. Frontal shots were trickier, dependent on hitting weak spots. The driver's vision port, the hull machine gun housing, the turret ring, the lower glacis plate. Warner knew the vulnerabilities. Every anti-tank gunner studied them, memorized them, dreamed about them. But knowing where to aim and actually hitting a moving target under fire were entirely different propositions. The first German attacks came on December 19. Probing assaults, infantry mostly, testing the defenses, searching for gaps. The Americans threw them back. The Germans shelled the positions throughout the night. Warner and his crew huddled in their pit, as 88 shells screamed overhead and mortar rounds detonated in the trees, sending heart shrapnel whining through the darkness. No one slept. They ate cold rations, checked their ammunition, whispered prayers or curses depending on temperament, and waited for dawn. The tankers of the 12th SS Panzer Division had their own expectations, their own mythology. They had been told that American troops were soft, poorly trained, quick to surrender. They had been told that one German soldier was worth 10 Americans. They had been told that they were the elite, the tip of the spear, the bearers of Germany's military tradition. Some believed it completely. Others harbored doubts but kept them silent. What united them was the tank itself. Inside a Panzer IV, the world was reduced to narrow vision slits, periscopes, and the roar of the engine. The smell of gasoline and oil filled the crew compartment. The commander stood in the turret, exposed from the chest up when the hatch was open, his throat microphone pressed against his larynx, shouting orders to the driver, the gunner, the loader. The gunner peered through his optics, hand on the traverse wheel, foot near the firing pedal, watching for targets. The loader muscled shells from the ready rack, heavy cylinders of brass and steel, slamming them into the breech, stepping back, shouting, "Ready." The driver sat forward in the hull, hands on the steering levers, sweat running down his face despite the cold, navigating by limited vision, and shouted instructions. The radio operator, when present, hunched over his equipment in the hull, monitoring frequencies, relaying messages, manning the hull machine gun. They were a crew, interdependent, vulnerable in ways that propaganda never acknowledged. The Panzer IV was not the most fearsome tank Germany produced. That distinction belonged to the Tiger and the Panther. But the Panzer IV was the workhorse, the most numerous, the most reliable. Its long-barreled 75 gun could destroy most Allied tanks at range. Its armor, though not impervious, provided reasonable protection against standard anti-tank weapons. But reasonable protection is not invulnerability. The hull armor on the Panzer IV was 80 thick on the front, sloped at modest angles. The turret front was 50 the sides were 30 the rear was 20 These numbers represented compromises between protection, weight, and production capacity. German industry in late 1944 could not produce enough heavy armor for every vehicle. Quality control suffered. Steel alloys varied in composition. Welding was sometimes hasty. Armor plate that should have resisted a hit occasionally cracked or spalled, sending fragments into the crew compartment. And certain points were inherently weak. The turret ring where the turret met the hull was a seam that could be exploited. The driver's vision port, a necessary opening, created a weak point in the frontal armor. The lower glacis plate, less steeply angled than the upper plate, was more vulnerable to penetration. An experienced anti-tank gunner aimed for these points. An inexperienced gunner aimed center mass and hoped. The morning of December 20 began with artillery fire. German guns hammered the American positions, the shells walking up and down the line in methodical patterns. Warner pressed himself against the frozen earth, mouth open to equalize pressure, hands over his ears. The concussions felt like being punched in the chest by an invisible giant. Dirt and snow rained down. A tree 50 meters away took a direct hit and exploded into splinters. Then the barrage lifted. In the sudden silence, Warner heard his own heartbeat, a rapid drum in his ears. He raised his head, peered over the edge of the gun pit. Movement, through the trees, through the lingering smoke, shapes resolving into vehicles. Tanks, lots of tanks, at least 10 of them, accompanied by infantry spread out in skirmish lines. They were coming straight down the road, straight toward his position. This was not a probe. This was a deliberate assault, intended to smash through the American line and open the road to Butgenbach and beyond. Warner's training took over. He and his crew swung the gun toward the road. The gunner, a replacement soldier whose name Warner had learned only days earlier, squinted through the sight. The loader stood ready, a high-velocity armor-piercing round already chambered. Warner knelt beside the gun, observing, calculating. The tanks were still at range. Wait, let them come closer. The 57 gun was accurate, but at long range the shell lost velocity, lost penetrating power. Better to hold fire until the target was close enough that a hit would matter. 300 yards, 250. The lead tank was a Panzer IV, its long gun traversing slowly, searching for threats. 200 yards. Warner tapped the gunner's shoulder. The first one. Aim for the lower hull. The gunner nodded, adjusted his aim, held his breath. Warner watched through binoculars. The range was good. The angle was good. Fire, the gun cracked. The recoil sent the carriage sliding backward several inches. The shell flew across the space between them in a fraction of a second, a supersonic projectile leaving a thin vapor trail in the cold air. It struck the Panzer IV low on the hull, just to the left of the driver's position. The impact was visible even at this distance, a bright flash of metal on metal. The tank lurched, stopped. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The crew hatches flew open. Men scrambled out, dropping to the ground, running for cover. Warner's crew cheered, a brief exultation quickly suppressed. No time to celebrate. The second tank was still coming. They reloaded. The loader shoved another round into the breech, his movements fast and practiced despite his lack of experience. Some things the body learned quickly under the pressure of survival. The second tank, alerted now by the destruction of the first, tried to bring its gun to bear. Warner saw the turret traversing, the long barrel swinging in their direction. It was a race. Who could fire first? The gunner made a minute adjustment, compensating for the changing angle. Fire, the gun spoke again. The shell flew. This time the impact was higher, striking the Panzer IV turret just below the gun mantlet. There was a flash, a loud clang, and the tank shuddered. The turret stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the commander's hatch. The loader inside must have been killed or wounded, or perhaps the gun mechanism was damaged. The tank reversed, backing away, its commander hanging half out of the hatch, frantically waving his arms. 2 down. Warner felt a surge of grim satisfaction. 2 German tanks destroyed in less than a minute. The mythology of Panzer invincibility seemed suddenly brittle, vulnerable to the realities of ballistics and geometry. But the third tank was not retreating. Its commander had seen where the American anti-tank gun was positioned. He was advancing, accelerating, attempting to close the distance and bring his superior firepower to bear before Warner's crew could reload again. The German gunner was good. His first shot hit the ground 10 feet in front of Warner's position, throwing up a gout of frozen earth and snow. The concussion was stunning. Warner's ears rang, his vision blurred. He shook his head, trying to clear it. The loader was struggling with the next round, his hands shaking now, adrenaline and fear making him clumsy. The shell slipped from his grasp, fell to the floor of the pit. Precious seconds lost. Warner grabbed the shell himself, lifted it, shoved it into the breech, locked it home. Ready, the gunner was already lining up the shot, but the Panzer was close now, less than 100 yards and moving. The German tank fired again. This time the shell passed directly overhead, a freight train roar, and detonated somewhere behind them. Warner felt the heat of the muzzle blast. Now the gunner fired. The shell struck the Panzer IV on the turret ring, that weak point where armor met armor and penetrated. There was a different quality to this impact, not just a flash but a detonation, a secondary explosion inside the tank. The turret seemed to lift slightly, flames erupting from every opening. The tank rolled to a stop. No one got out. Silence, temporary, illusory. The German infantry was still advancing, and more tanks were visible further back. But for a moment, Warner and his crew sat in their gun pit, breathing hard, staring at what they had done. 3 German tanks, destroyed or disabled, in a span of less than 2 minutes. The mythology of the invincible Panzer seemed to be just that, mythology. But Warner knew better than to celebrate. The battle was far from over. American machine guns opened up on the advancing German infantry, forcing them to ground. The rattle of .30 caliber fire mixed with the deeper bark of German MG-42s. Rifle shots cracked. Grenades detonated. All along the American line, other anti-tank guns and bazooka teams engaged the remaining German armor. A Panther tank 200 yards to the north took a bazooka round to the side and burst into flames. A Panzer IV further down the road was hit by another 57 mm gun and began belching black smoke. The Germans had expected to roll through the American positions. They were discovering, expensively, that green troops could still fight when properly positioned and equipped. The symbolism of the gun became potent in those minutes. Not the tanks with their mythology and propaganda value, but the simple anti-tank gun, a weapon of defense, of holding ground, of saying no to the advancing tide. The 57mm gun was not glamorous. It did not inspire newsreels or admiration. It was a tool, a piece of equipment, heavy and cumbersome and difficult to move. It required a crew working in coordination. It had no armor to protect its operators, but when employed correctly, it was devastating. It represented something fundamental about warfare that the mythology of Blitzkrieg often obscured. Defense could defeat offense. Static positions could stop mobile forces. Determination and training could overcome supposed technological or doctrinal superiority. Warner did not think in these terms. He thought in terms of survival, of reloading, of the next target. But the broader truth was there, manifesting in the burning wrecks along the road. The unstoppable Panzer could be stopped. It had been stopped. It was being stopped. The German attack faltered. Their infantry, pinned down by American fire, could not advance without tank support. Their tanks, facing a gauntlet of anti-tank weapons, could not advance without infantry support to suppress those weapons. It was the classic combined arms dilemma, and the Germans, despite their experience and training, had no easy solution. They withdrew, pulling back to regroup, leaving their burning vehicles behind. Warner and his crew counted their remaining ammunition. They had expended 7 rounds. They had 17 left. It would have to be enough. American artillery, positioned behind the lines, began dropping shells on the German assembly areas, long-range harassment fire to disrupt the enemy's preparations for the next assault. The sound of the guns was reassuring, a reminder that Warner's crew was not alone, that there was a system, an organization, a military structure supporting them. But that structure was fragile. The 2nd Battalion was under strength. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements were non-existent. They would have to hold with what they had. The German perspective was one of frustrated disbelief. The young men of the 12th SS Panzer Division had been raised on stories of German military excellence. They had been told that the Wehrmacht was the finest fighting force in the world. They had been shown films of past victories, of columns of prisoners, of tanks rolling through Arc de Triomphe in Paris, of the swastika flying over the Acropolis in Athens. They had been trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment, their tactics, their leadership. And yet here they were, stopped by a thin line of American troops armed with weapons that, according to propaganda, should have been inadequate. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some explained it away as bad luck, poor intelligence, unexpected resistance that would be overcome with the next attack. Others began to quietly question the narratives they had been fed. If the Americans were so weak, why were they fighting so hard? If German tanks were so superior, why were they burning along the road? The answers to these questions were dangerous. They led to doubt. Doubt led to hesitation. Hesitation led to defeat. And so the questions were suppressed, and preparations for the next assault continued. The night of December 20 was bitter. The temperature dropped below freezing. Warner and his crew took turns on watch, huddling together for warmth, stamping their feet to keep circulation going. Hot food was impassable. They ate cold rations from cans, condensed milk and crackers and cheese that tasted like wax. Sleep came in brief snatches, interrupted by the sound of distant shellfire or the sudden crack of a sniper's rifle. At some point during the night, a runner arrived from battalion headquarters with a message: hold at all costs, no withdrawal. The entire defensive line depended on their section holding. If they broke, the Germans would pour through, encircle other positions, collapse the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Hold at all costs. The phrase echoed in Warner's mind. He wondered what it meant in practical terms. Did it mean fight until the ammunition was gone? Fight until the gun was destroyed? Fight until they were all dead? He did not share these thoughts with his crew. They were looking to him for confidence, for leadership, for some indication that they would survive this. He gave them what he could: calm words, a steady demeanor, the illusion of control. Dawn on December 21 came grey and cold. The German artillery began again, a rolling barrage that seemed to go on forever. Warner pressed himself into the bottom of the gun pit, willing himself smaller, invisible, invulnerable. The shells were falling closer now, methodically working over the American positions. A blast 20 yards away threw a body into the air, some unlucky soldier caught in the open. The concussion rattled Warner's teeth. His nose began to bleed. He wiped it on his sleeve and kept his head down. The barrage lifted. Warner knew what came next. He raised his head, peered through the smoke. Tanks, more than before. He counted at least 6 Panzer Roman IV on the road, plus a Panther tank further back, its long-barreled 75 mm gun unmistakable. Infantry followed in greater numbers, spread out, moving in short rushes covered by machine gun fire. This was a serious effort. This was the main assault. Warner shouted to his crew, "Get ready." They scrambled to their positions. The gunner, pale and exhausted, wiped his eyes and bent to the sight. The loader grabbed a shell from the ammunition rack, cradling it like something precious. Warner checked the breech, checked the traverse, checked everything he could think to check. The Panzers were at 300 yards and closing. He let them come to 200 yards, then 150. The closer, the better. The first shot had to count. The lead Panzer was advancing cautiously now, its commander aware that somewhere ahead was the anti-tank gun that had destroyed 3 of his comrades yesterday. He was scanning, searching, his head visible above the turret rim. Warner pointed. "That one. Turret if you can. Hull if you can't." The gunner nodded. The gun was already trained on the target. The loader confirmed ready. Warner took a breath. Fire. The 57 mm cracked. The shell struck the Panzer Roman IV on the front slope of the hull, low and angled. It should have been a penetration. It was not. The shell ricocheted, bouncing off the armor in a shower of sparks, deflecting upward and away. A bad angle. A bad hit. The Panzer's commander reacted instantly, traversing his turret, bringing his gun to bear. Warner saw the muzzle swing toward them, black and cavernous. Reload. Now, the loader was already moving, but it takes time to reload a 57 mm gun, time measured in seconds, and sometimes seconds are too long. The Panzer fired. The shell hit the edge of Warner's gun pit, a direct impact on the earthen berm they had piled up for protection. The explosion was enormous. Dirt and sandbags and fragments of wood flew everywhere. Warner was thrown backward, ears ringing, vision filled with white light and then darkness at the edges. He could not hear. He could not see properly. He shook his head, gasping for air. Dust and smoke filled his lungs. When his vision cleared, he saw his crew scattered, one man lying motionless, another crawling, clutching his leg. The gun was intact but displaced, its trail twisted. The gunner was slumped against the wheel, blood running from his ears. Warner grabbed the gunner, shook him. No response. He checked for a pulse. Found one. The man was alive but unconscious. The loader, the one clutching his leg, was screaming something Warner could not hear through the ringing in his ears. The other crewman was not moving at all. Warner crawled to him, checked him, found him dead, chest torn open by shrapnel. 3 men, a gun crew of 4, and now 3 were casualties. Warner was alone. He looked at the gun, looked at the Panzer, now advancing again, certain it had destroyed the threat. Looked at his own hands, shaking, covered in dirt and blood, some of it his own from a cut he did not remember receiving. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of the pit, to flee into the woods and survive. No one would blame him. His crew was dead or dying. His position was compromised. Staying was suicide. He stayed. Later, when asked why, he would not have a good answer. Duty, perhaps. Stubbornness. The knowledge that if he fled, others would die and the line would break. He dragged the wounded loader to the edge of the pit, pushed him out, shouted for him to crawl back to the aid station. Then Warner returned to the gun. Alone, he checked the mechanism. It was intact. The breech was closed, a round still chambered from before the hit. The traverse worked stiffly but functionally. The gun was still in the fight, which meant Warner was still in the fight. He grabbed the handwheel, traversed the gun toward the advancing Panzer. The tank was close now, less than 100 yards, its engine roaring, its treads clanking over the frozen ground. Its gun was trained on his position, but the commander was scanning other areas now, looking for additional threats. Warner sighted through the optics. The crosshairs swam in his vision, doubled, steadied. He adjusted elevation. The Panzer was moving slightly left to right. Laid the target. Compensate for movement. Aim for the lower hull. He pulled the firing lever. The gun cracked. The shell flew. Struck. Penetrated. The Panzer shuddered, its engine note changing, a grinding mechanical scream. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The tank lurched to a stop. Crew hatches opened. Men bailed out, one of them on fire, rolling in the snow. Warner did not watch. He was already reloading, moving like a machine, muscle memory carrying him through the steps. Open the breech. Extract the spent casing. Still hot, gloves protecting his hands from the heat. Grab a new shell from the rack. Lift it, heavy, forearms burning. Insert it into the breech. Close the breech. Lock it. Ready. The next Panzer was moving up, attempting to push past the burning wreck of its comrade. Warner traversed the gun. Fired. Missed. The shell went high, passing over the tank's turret. Cursed. Reloaded. Fired again. This time the shell struck the Panzer's tracks, shearing off a link, immobilizing it. The tank could still fight, but could not advance. Its turret traversed toward Warner's position. He ducked as the tank fired, the shell passing overhead with a sound like the world tearing apart, detonating somewhere behind him. He did not look to see where. There was only the gun, only the next shot, only the mechanical process of loading, aiming, firing. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes compressed into seconds. Warner operated in a state of pure focus, stripped of fear and thought, reduced to action and reaction. He fired again. Hit. Another Panzer stopped smoking. He fired again. Missed. Fired again. Hit. The German infantry was all around now, engaging American positions along the line, but no one seemed to notice the lone anti-tank gun still firing, still fighting. Or perhaps they did notice and could not get close enough to do anything about it. American machine guns cut down anyone who tried to approach the gun pit. Artillery shells rained down on both sides, a chaotic maelstrom of explosions and smoke, and the screams of wounded men. Warner reloaded again. His hands were bleeding now, cut by the rough metal of the shells, but he did not feel it. Adrenaline had pushed him beyond pain, beyond exhaustion, into some other state where only the immediate task mattered. Then the gun jammed. He pulled the firing lever and nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing. The mechanism had seized. A fragment of the earlier German shell must have damaged something, bent something, and now, after 5 more rounds, the strain had caused a failure. Warner stared at the gun in disbelief, then at the advancing 3rd Panzer, now only 30 yards away, grinding toward his position, its gun depressing to fire directly into the pit. There was no time to fix the jam, no time to retreat, no time for anything, except Warner looked at his pistol, the .45 caliber M1911 A1 in the holster on his hip, a weapon utterly inadequate for fighting a tank, a weapon designed to engage targets at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards, a weapon with 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. 8 shots against a 30-ton armored vehicle. It was absurd. It was insane. It was all he had. Warner drew the pistol. He climbed out of the gun pit, standing fully upright in the middle of a battlefield, exposed to fire from every direction. The Panzer was so close he could see the details of its construction, the welds, the registration numbers painted on the hull, the spare track links bolted to the front armor. He could see the commander in the turret, a young man, perhaps younger than Warner, wearing a black tanker's uniform and a throat microphone, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of an American soldier standing in the open with nothing but a pistol. For a moment, both men simply stared at each other across the diminishing space between them. Then the German tank commander reached for his own sidearm, a Luger or a Walther P-38, pulling it from its holster. This was no longer a tank versus gun engagement. This was a pistol duel. 2 men with handguns, separated by 20 yards, each trying to kill the other before being killed. Warner fired first. The .45 bucked in his hand, the recoil familiar, almost comforting. The bullet struck the German commander in the chest, staggering him backward. Warner fired again, and again. 3 shots in rapid succession, all hitting the commander, punching through the thin uniform tunic, tearing into flesh. The German dropped his pistol, clutched at his chest, fell back into the turret and out of sight. The Panzer slowed, stopped. Its crew, suddenly leaderless, did not know what to do. The gunner could not see what had happened. The driver heard only the engine and received no orders. For several seconds the tank sat there, idling, a mechanical beast without a brain. Then the driver, sensing something was wrong, began to reverse, backing away from the American line, retreating. The remaining German tanks, seeing one of their number withdraw, also began to pull back. The infantry, without armored support, could not continue the assault. They went to ground, tried to disengage, pulled back in small groups, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Warner stood there, pistol still raised, breathing hard, unable to process what had just happened. He had shot the commander of a panzer with a pistol. He had fought a duel with a tank and won. It should not have been possible. It defied everything he understood about combat. But the burning tanks along the road testified to the reality of it. The retreating Germans confirmed it. He had stopped them. Not alone, there were others all along the line fighting just as desperately, but his contribution was undeniable. The mythology of the invincible panzer had been confronted by the reality of a determined gunner with inadequate tools and a refusal to yield. He stumbled back to the gun pit, legs shaking, suddenly aware of the cold, the pain in his hands, the ringing in his ears, the taste of blood in his mouth. He sat down heavily, back against the earthen wall, pistol still in his hand. Medics were moving up now, tending to the wounded. Someone shouted his name. He did not respond. He was staring at nothing, seeing everything, replaying the last 15 minutes in his mind, unable to reconcile the man he had been with the actions he had taken. He had been a shoe salesman. He sold footwear. He measured feet and made small talk and rang up sales. 2 years ago. Only 2 years. The distance between that life and this moment seemed infinite. The respite was brief. The German artillery began again, a precursor to another assault. Warner forced himself to his feet, moved back to the gun, tried again to clear the jam. It was hopeless. The mechanism was too damaged. The gun was out of the fight. He gathered up his remaining ammunition, pistol rounds, and prepared to defend the position with nothing more than his sidearm. If the Germans came again, he would shoot them. If they overran the position, he would shoot them until his ammunition was gone. If he died here, at least he would die fighting. There was a clarity to that thought, a simplicity that cut through the confusion and fear. It was not heroism. It was not courage. It was simply the decision to keep going, to not give up, to fulfill the mission he had been given, hold at all costs. The next German assault came in the late morning. This time Warner was not behind his gun, but in a shallow trench with a borrowed rifle, firing at advancing infantry, part of a ragged defensive line that should have broken but did not. The Germans pushed hard, got within 50 yards of the American positions, were thrown back by concentrated fire. They tried again from a different angle, were met by artillery fire that tore their formations apart. They tried a third time, using smoke to obscure their advance, and almost succeeded, getting into hand-to-hand combat range before being repulsed in brutal close-quarters fighting. Warner fired his rifle until the barrel was too hot to touch, then switched to his pistol, then back to the rifle. He lost count of how many rounds he expended. He did not know if he hit anyone. In the chaos, individual actions blurred into a collective effort, the line holding because everyone on it decided to hold. By noon, the German attacks ceased. They had exhausted their offensive capability, at least temporarily. The road to Butgenbach was littered with wrecked vehicles and bodies. American casualties were heavy but not catastrophic. They had held. The northern shoulder of the Bulge remained intact. Warner was ordered back to the aid station to have his hands treated. He refused, insisting he was fine, that others needed help more than he did. The medic ignored him and dragged him back anyway, wrapping his hands in gauze, checking him for other injuries. Warner had a concussion, multiple lacerations, hearing damage, and exhaustion so profound he could barely stand. The medic told him he was done, that he would be evacuated to the rear for rest. Warner shook his head. "I'm fine. I'm going back," the medic argued. Warner ignored him and walked back to his position. The next morning, December 22, the Germans came again, this time with a Panzer IV that emerged from the morning mist like a spectre, its engine idling low, moving slowly, cautiously. Warner was manning a borrowed 57mm gun, another cruise weapon, his own still disabled. He sighted on the Panzer, calculated the angle, waited for the range to close. At 100 yards he fired. The shell struck the Panzer on the turret, setting the engine compartment on fire. But the return fire was immediate. A burst from a German MG-42, spraying the American positions with 7.92mm rounds at 1,200 rounds per minute. Warner felt the impacts, 2 rounds striking him, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the side. He fell backward, bleeding, unable to move his right arm. His crew dragged him away from the gun. He tried to protest, to tell them he was fine, but the words would not come. Blood filled his mouth. The world became distant, sounds muffled, vision narrowing. Henry Warner died on December 21, 1944. He was 21 years old. His body was recovered later and buried in a military cemetery in Belgium, one of thousands of white crosses stretching in neat rows across the frozen ground. In July 1945, his family received notification that he had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Butgenbach. The citation read, "Serving as 57mm anti-tank gunner with the 2D Battalion, Corporal Warner was a major factor in stopping enemy tanks during heavy attacks against the battalion position near Butgenbach, Belgium, on 20-21 December 1944. During the first attack, launched in the early morning of the 20th, enemy tanks succeeded in penetrating parts of the line. Corporal Warner, disregarding the concentrated machine gun and tank fire, inflicted heavy casualties on dismounted enemy troops attempting to advance. He knocked out 3 enemy tanks in quick succession, causing others to withdraw. After his gun was disabled by enemy fire, he continued to fight with his pistol, killing a German tank commander in a pistol duel. The following day, when another attack developed, he again manned his gun until wounded by machine gun fire. His valiant deed and intrepid conduct contributed immeasurably to the successful defense of the battalion position. The mythology of the invincible Panzer did not survive the war. By 1945, it had been thoroughly dismantled by the realities of combat on multiple fronts. German armor was destroyed in the thousands by Soviet tanks, American tank destroyers, British anti-tank guns, fighter bombers, artillery, mines, and the simple mathematics of attrition. The production capacity of the Allies dwarfed Germany's ability to replace losses. Every Panther destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Tiger lost was a strategic defeat. By the time the war ended, the black cross on grey armor no longer inspired fear. It inspired confidence in Allied soldiers who had learned, through bitter experience, that German tanks could be killed, and that the men inside them bled the same as everyone else. The mythology had given way to reality. The invincible had been shown to be vincible. The unstoppable had been stopped. But the reality was more complex than a simple narrative of German defeat. The Panzer divisions at their peak were genuinely formidable. They represented a synthesis of tactical innovation, technological capability, and operational audacity that achieved stunning results. The problem was not that the mythology was entirely false. The problem was that it obscured the vulnerabilities, the limitations, the dependencies that constrained German armored warfare from the beginning. Fuel shortages, mechanical unreliability, overtaxed supply lines, insufficient production capacity, training time shortened by desperation, crew quality declining as veterans were killed and replaced by novices. These factors accumulated, compounded, eventually overwhelmed whatever advantages German doctrine and equipment provided. The Panzer at Stan in 1940 and the Panzer at Butgenbach in 1944 were separated by only 4 years, but the context had changed entirely. In 1940, the Germans were attacking a disorganized enemy with well-trained, well-supplied forces. In 1944, they were attacking prepared defenses with depleted, under-resourced formations. The outcome was predictable. The symbol that lingered in Warner's story was not the tank but the gun. The anti-tank gun represented defensive warfare, the decision to stand and fight rather than retreat, the willingness to absorb punishment and keep fighting. It was not glamorous. It did not inspire propaganda posters or heroic narratives. It was simply a tool that, when used by determined men, could achieve decisive results. Warner's 57 gun, in the span of a few minutes, destroyed multiple German tanks and broke the momentum of an assault. That gun, and the thousands like it deployed along defensive lines across Europe, represented the unsexy, unglamorous, essential work of warfare, holding ground, denying the enemy's objectives, making them pay for every yard. The attackers get the glory. The defenders get the gratitude of those they protect. Warner's pistol, in contrast, became a symbol of something else: improvisation in extremis. When the gun jammed and the situation became desperate, he used the only tool available, a weapon utterly inadequate for the task, and somehow succeeded. It was not a tactic that could be taught. It was not a method that could be replicated. It was a moment of individual agency, in a system designed to minimize individual agency. Warner did not think about symbolism or narrative when he drew his pistol and confronted a panzer. He thought about survival and duty, and the immediate necessity of stopping the enemy. But the act itself carried meaning that transcended his intentions. It said, even when outmatched, even when the tools are inadequate, even when survival seems impossible, resistance is still possible. That message resonated with those who heard his story, then and later. It resonated because it contradicted the mythology of technological determinism, the idea that superior equipment guarantees victory. Warner, with his pistol, defeated a panzer with its 75 gun, not because the pistol was better, but because the man wielding it refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. The transformation that occurred in the minds of German tankers during the Battle of the Bulge was subtle but profound. They began the offensive believing in their own superiority, in the mythology of the panzer, in the inevitability of German victory. They ended it shattered, demoralized, aware that the Americans they had been taught to despise were, in fact, formidable opponents. The young men of the 12th SS Panzer Division, raised on Hitler Youth ideology, discovered that ideology did not stop armor-piercing shells. Belief in the Führer did not prevent tanks from burning. The swastika on their uniforms did not make them invincible. At Butgenbach, they learned that warfare is not about mythology or ideology. It is about logistics, training, preparation, and the willingness to endure. The Americans had all of those things. The Germans, by December 1944, were running out of all of them. The realization did not come all at once. It came in increments, each failed attack eroding confidence, each casualty raising doubts, until the cumulative weight became unbearable. By the time the offensive collapsed in January 1945, the survivors of the 12th SS Panzer Division were not the confident, fanatical believers they had been a month earlier. They were exhausted, traumatized men who had seen the limits of their own power. The American experience was also transformative, though in a different way. The green replacements of the 26th Infantry Regiment arrived in Belgium terrified and uncertain, aware of their inexperience, doubting their ability to stand against veteran German troops. Within a week, they had become veterans themselves. They had faced the panzers and stopped them. They had endured artillery barrages and infantry assaults and held their ground. The transformation was not comfortable. It came at the cost of friends killed, comrades maimed, and the psychological toll of sustained combat. But it was real. The men who left Butgenbach were not the same men who arrived. They had learned that they could fight. They had learned that determination and preparation could compensate for inexperience. They had learned that mythology was just mythology, and that the outcome of battles was determined not by propaganda, but by who fought harder, who held longer, who refused to break. These were lessons that could not be taught in training. They could only be learned in combat. Warner's actions at Butgenbach were not unique. All along the northern shoulder of the Bulge, small units and individual soldiers performed similar acts of desperate courage. Tank destroyers engaged panzers at point-blank range. Bazooka teams stalked German armor through snow and darkness. Artillery forward observers called fire down on their own positions when they were about to be overrun. Infantry squads held isolated positions against overwhelming odds, sometimes succeeding, sometimes being wiped out, but always making the Germans pay. These actions, collectively, determined the outcome of the battle. The German offensive depended on speed, on breaking through quickly and exploiting success before the Allies could react. Every delay, every roadblock, Every stubborn defense disrupted the timetable. Butgenbach was supposed to fall on December 19. It did not. It held through December 20, through December 21, through the critical days when the German offensive might still have succeeded. By the time the Germans abandoned their attempts to capture it, the entire offensive was failing. Fuel shortages immobilized panzer formations. Allied reinforcements poured into the salient. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to decimate German supply columns. The Battle of the Bulge became a battle of attrition, and in a battle of attrition, the Allies always won. The epilogue of Warner's story is found not in his death, but in the ripples his actions created. The men who served with him carried his example forward. They told his story to replacements, to new recruits, to anyone who would listen. The story changed in the telling, details added or omitted, the narrative shaped by the needs of the moment. Sometimes Warner became larger than life, a hero of mythological proportions. Sometimes he remained a man, flawed and frightened and doing his best. Both versions were true. He was a man who did something extraordinary under conditions that demanded it. The Medal of Honor citation reduced his actions to a few sentences. The reality was more complex. Hours of terror, moments of decision, the grinding exhaustion of sustained combat, the luck of surviving one engagement only to face another. But the citation captured the essence. He stopped the Germans. He held the line. He did not yield. The broader truth that Warner's story illuminates is this: freedom is defended not by invincible forces, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept defeat. The mythology of military power suggests that superior equipment, superior training, superior doctrine guarantee victory. Warner's story refutes that suggestion. He was a shoe salesman with abbreviated training, armed with a gun that jammed and a pistol that should have been useless, facing an enemy armored force that had conquered much of Europe. By all reasonable calculations, he should have been overrun, killed, forgotten. Instead, he stopped multiple tanks, survived multiple assaults, and through his example inspired others to hold when holding seemed impossible. That is the truth about freedom. It is not guaranteed by technology or mythology. It is guaranteed by individuals who choose, in critical moments, to stand, to fight, to endure. Warner made that choice on December 20, 1944. He made it again on December 21. He paid for it with his life. But his choice mattered. It changed the outcome of the battle. It contributed, in some small but meaningful way, to the outcome of the war. The symbolic resonance of Warner's pistol extends beyond the immediate tactical situation. It represents the idea that even the most inadequate tools can achieve decisive results when wielded by determined hands. The Panzer represented industrial warfare, the concentration of resources and technology into a single overwhelming weapon. The pistol represented the individual, armed with almost nothing, refusing to concede. The duel between them was unequal in every measurable way except one: will. Warner's will to fight exceeded the German commander's will to continue the engagement. When faced with return fire, even pistol fire, the German chose to disengage. That choice was entirely rational. He was exposed. He was under fire. His crew was without leadership in the critical moment. But the choice also revealed a truth. No armor is impervious to determination. No tank is immune to the human factor. The mythology of the invincible Panzer could not account for the Warner factor, the individual who refuses to behave according to expectations, who does the impossible because the impossible is all that is left. The Cold War decades that followed World War II saw the creation of new mythologies around armored warfare. Tanks became larger, faster, more heavily armed, more technologically sophisticated. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces faced each other across the inner German border with thousands of tanks, and analysts debated scenarios of massive armored clashes that thankfully never occurred. The mythology shifted but persisted. The idea that modern warfare was primarily about technology, and that technological superiority would determine outcomes. Warner's story, along with thousands of similar stories from World War II, suggested a more complex reality. Technology mattered, but it was not determinative. Human factors, training, morale, leadership, determination, the willingness to endure, mattered at least as much. The best tank in the world is just an immobile pillbox without fuel. The most advanced weapon system is useless without a trained crew to operate it. And even the most obsolete weapon can achieve decisive results in the hands of someone who refuses to quit. The mythology of abundance also played a role in the American success during World War II, though Warner's story touches on it only obliquely. American soldiers were, by 1944, the best-fed, best-equipped forces in the world. They had access to medical care, to rest and recuperation, to replacement equipment when their gear broke. They had air support, artillery support, supply chains that delivered ammunition and food and fuel with remarkable consistency. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of industrial capacity, logistical planning, and national resources mobilized for war. The German soldier, in contrast, by late 1944, was often hungry, undersupplied operating equipment that could not be repaired, attacking without adequate air or artillery support. The difference was not individual quality. German soldiers were often experienced and highly motivated. The difference was systemic. America could afford to lose tanks and build more. Germany could not. America could afford to train replacement crews thoroughly. Germany could not. America could afford to feed its soldiers well and give them rest. Germany could not. Warner's ability to hold his position was enabled by this systemic advantage. His gun was American-made, supplied through a logistics chain that stretched back across the Atlantic. His ammunition was plentiful. His food, though cold, was nutritious. His medical care, though basic by modern standards, was far better than anything available to the average German soldier. The mythology of American abundance was not just propaganda. It was reality, and it mattered. The final symbolic element in Warner's story is the ground itself. Butgenbach was a small Belgian village with no strategic value except its position. It sat on a road the Germans needed to use. That was all. But in warfare, position is everything. The village became important because the Americans chose to defend it and the Germans chose to attack it. The frozen earth that Warner and his crew dug into became sacred not because of any inherent quality, but because men fought and died there. The gun pit, the road, the tree line, the field of fire, all of these mundane geographical features became laden with significance through the actions that occurred there. After the war, Butgenbach returned to being a small village. The gun pits were filled in. The burned-out tanks were removed. The ground was reclaimed by farmers. But the significance remained, invisible, carried in memory and history. Warner's story is attached to that place, that frozen road, that December morning. It cannot be separated from it. Place and action merged into narrative, and the narrative endures. The lesson, if Warner's story has a lesson, is not about heroism or glory. It is about necessity. Warner did not charge the Panzer because he wanted to be a hero. He fought because fighting was the only option available that allowed him to live with himself. Surrender would have been easier. Retreat would have been safer. But both would have meant abandoning his comrades, abandoning his position, abandoning his duty. He could not do those things, not because he was superhuman, but because he was human, and humans, when properly motivated, are capable of extraordinary things. The mythology of the invincible Panzer suggested that individual action did not matter, that the outcome was determined by technology and resources. Warner proved otherwise. One man with a jammed gun and a pistol stopped multiple tanks, not through superior technology, not through overwhelming force, through will, skill, and the refusal to accept defeat. That is the truth that survives when the mythologies fade. In the end, the unstoppable Panzer was stopped, not by another tank, not by air power or artillery, though those contributed. It was stopped by a gunner who kept firing, kept fighting, kept standing, even when every rational calculation suggested he should run. Warner's last shots, fired from a borrowed weapon with bleeding hands and damaged hearing, broke the German assault and preserved the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The strategic implications rippled outward, affecting the entire course of the battle, and, by extension, the entire course of the war in Europe. Historians debate grand strategies and operational decisions. Warner's story reminds us that history is also made in gun pits, by frightened young men who decide, in critical moments, to hold, to fight, to endure. That decision, repeated thousands of times across thousands of battlefields, determined the outcome of the Second World War. The mythologies we construct around military power obscure that simple truth, but the truth remains as solid and real as the frozen ground of Butgenbach. Freedom is defended not by invincible forces, but by vincible men who refuse to yield.